Everything you need to know about products and services that can improve your life. This is Experts on Call on CL 650.
And we're back to Quay Pacific's Talk About Strata. It's 650 CL, and tonight we're talking to Dan Schmidt and Sean Lang. Dan is a paint specialist from Remdale Painting, and Sean is an inspector with Interprovincial Roof Consultants. And both of you have had experience with building systems, obviously, and roofing systems and decks and balconies. But one of the growing problems that we have are the number of buildings that have rooftop decks. They have decks over top of wood surfaces or concrete surfaces, or areas that are exposed that obviously get a lot more wear and tear. So some deal with paint materials, some deal with finishing sealants, concrete sealants, and those types of products and materials. But from a roofing perspective, I think, Sean, we'll start with you. What kind of recommendation can you give to a strata that are dealing with rooftop decks?
Well, there's a few things that have to be considered there. Whether they're installing a new deck system, you want to think about the age of the roof system it's going to be sitting on. Because if it is an aging roof system, maybe you want to hold off on installing that deck system, or at least build the deck system so it's movable. One of the things we see quite often is they'll build this glorious, vast wood deck, and it's all intertied together. There's no separations between any of the there's no panels. So basically, if you build it in sections that are then stuck together, and they could be actually fastened together, but with one fastener sort of thing, so you can take it apart. Also, making sure that your drains are accessible if they're under the deck. That's a big one too, because they'll actually bury them. And quite often, because the deck is low profile, they want to stay below or at the height of the doorways. They build them so that they're actually crushing the strainers on the drains, or they remove the strainers on the drains, which is a bad thing to do. But you can actually get custom strainers made if you needed to have it so it's a reduced height to accommodate your deck, which I don't technically recommend because you want some height on that strainer, but if you have to, at least have it reduced and not just crushed or removed completely. The other thing we see quite often is improperly protecting the roof membrane that's on there, not putting down rubber pads or expanded polystyrene foam underneath the wood decking, making sure that those pads that are below the decking actually have spaces to allow water to drain. That's another big problem that we see. So if you do take the necessary protection and you accommodate the roof system, which should be your primary focus, by the way, because you're building on top of a functioning membrane. So although you're trying to achieve a really nice, comfortable area, you're actually potentially putting something at risk that's protecting the entire building. So you have to keep that in mind. It's a very important issue.
So we had an email, Dan, it's kind of interesting because it deals exactly with this issue. So we have an Strata Corporation. They have 4 penthouse units, and they have rooftop decks. And what they've done is they recently replaced the roof. They, as Sean said, they put rubber mats down under the pressure areas under the deck system. So they did a great job of protecting it, put pressure-treated lumber back on. But this last summer, a number of owners, 3 out of the 4 owners, actually painted their deck surfaces. So they were decorating and got into painting them. So from a paint perspective now, of course, this has come back to haunt them because now the paint is peeling and they have a problem with it plugging drains because it's coming off in large chunks. So pressure treated lumber and paint, what's your recommendation?
Yeah, well, in general, when wood's been pressure treated, the point of the pressure treating is that you then don't need to paint it to protect it. And so what they've done is they've really kind of stepped over the bounds of where they should have gone, and that's really too bad, because pressure treated wood, if it's done well, will protect that wood and keep it lasting long, and it can just weather away for a very, very long time. Wood lasts an awful long time in our environment.
Can you stain it?
Yeah, and your best surfaces that you can put on it, Sean, is exactly that. If you could put a stain on it, something that just penetrates into it, adds a little color to it, maybe adds a little more protection to the surface from that, but it isn't actually a thick coating that's going to peel, and that's typically what the mistakes that are made. They don't maybe prime it or prepare it well. If a deck is in place already, you can't get all the sides of that deck boarding painted anymore, and so a stain allows the wood to breathe a little more, but a paint will seal the top surface without sealing all the rest of the sides, the ends of the boards or the bottoms of the boards, and the moisture will get up in there. The sun will come and draw that moisture out and take the coating right with it. All of a sudden you'll have a really messy situation.
Does it accelerate the aging of the wood even though it's pressure treated if you've painted it?
Yeah, that's a question I'm not really sure on, and the reason I say that is it appears to. I've been on a number of surfaces where it's almost like the moisture gets drawn to the surface, the bottom surface of the paint. So if you picture the top is the paint,
Yes.
and now there's moisture just underneath that, right at the top of the wood. And it's almost like it begins to deteriorate the top surface of that wood, almost a little bit like rotting. It's not completely rotting, but the wood does then release the paint that much more quickly, it seems. So yes, it
Well,
appears
there
to.
is a big difference between pressure-treated lumber and kiln-dried lumber, right? Because kiln-dried lumber is going to be dry,
Hmm.
and the pressure-treated, you can actually squeeze the treatment. Like if it's a fresh piece of wood, you can actually squeeze it, and you can see the treatment almost pool up on the surface of it.
Right.
So if you then were to coat it, and I'm not speaking from a painter's point of view, but just from what I'm thinking here, if you were then to coat it and actually encapsulate it with a crust, which would be the end result of fully painting something, you're trapping that moisture within there.
Yeah.
And even though it's a treatment, it's still a form of moisture. And I guess that would be how it would possibly rot a little sooner over time.
Yeah.
If you didn't completely paint it the way you're saying, where they just kind of cap it with paint, then moisture, I've seen it on roofing situations where the moisture will accumulate between the layer as it's separating, and now it's sitting there, and it's further aggravating the wood that's underneath it.
Exactly, yeah. Pressure treated wood in general, I mean, the manufacturers will say if you need to paint it or stain it or something like that, give it time to dry out. You were talking, Sean, about how it's got that pressure treatment in it. That's the point of it. If it's weathering for, say, 6 months or something like that, typically a lot of that moisture will come out to the point where you could stain it. What's happened, though, it has weathered, so you need to be aware then that wood may need to be lightly sanded or prepared in some way in order to accept the stain, so you're not painting or staining over top of poor wood.
So go from pressure treated to cedar products. So we have cedar products that are used for, well, for roofing, but we have it for fencing frequently.
Hmm.
People buy cedar panels and install them in posts and pressure treated posts, and but they also paint cedar fencing. Is there a benefit to that, or does it prolong the life of it? Is it just purely cosmetic? Are there better ways of dealing with our cedar products as opposed to using paint materials on them?
Yeah. I It's really an aesthetic choice. It's really a choice where people are saying, you know what, I want it to be yellow, or I want it to be blue because I don't like the natural look of it, or I don't like that cedar look. Cedar is really our natural preserved wood.
Right.
Right? The oils
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
cedar are
Yes.
wonderful for preserving the wood, for keeping insects out, from keeping rot away. So as long as you can leave a natural cedar surface, it would be my preference to do that. And then when you do begin, it begins to dry out and it begins to crack a little bit. You may want to now begin to stain it, right? And after a couple of times of staining it, now maybe you're out 5 or 10 or 15 years out. Now maybe you need to prime and paint it and treat it like as if it's just a regular wood surface, because everything else is dried out of that.
Right. So just thinking about the different kind of products. So take cedar and transfer it over to roofing.
Hmm.
What's the difference, the benefits of and there are going to be different grades of roofing, of course. But are there benefits of cedar roofing over tar shingles, for example? Because we now have an issue with a lot of communities that are transitioning, right?
Yeah.
They originally had cedar shakes.
Yep.
The roof cycle lasted 12 to 18 years, maybe if they were lucky
Yeah.
on the first building, and they're transitioning. Are there actual benefits, or is it again come down to aesthetics?
It's largely aesthetics. The old cedar roofs from 30 years ago were a lot better than any new cedar roofs that are being put on now. If you go with a very heavy shake and you use stainless steel nails and it's installed by a real craftsman roofer, you're going to have a good roof system and it's going to last you a long time. But unfortunately,
It's going to be expensive too.
it's going to be very expensive. It's about 50% more than a typical laminated asphalt roof system, and that's
Right.
including the plywood that you have to add.
Right.
So the problem nowadays is there's more roofers installing the shingles, the asphalt shingles, so that it's more competitive, the pricing is a lot lower, and there's more guys that know how to do it properly. So the gene pool of actual cedar roofers has shrunk down to the guys that own their own mills, and the material is a little bit questionable, the application is questionable, so you're really taking a bit more of a gamble, and you have to pay a lot more to get a quality cedar roof system than you used to get.
Sean, is that the kind of first growth and second growth
Yeah.
kind of wood,
Well,
cedar kind of
you can
playing
still
come
get,
into play?
yeah, it is, because you get some contractors who don't really care. And what they don't, some guys don't realize that out of a bundle of shingles, you're supposed to throw away all the bad ones. right? All the cedar, the bad ones that have knots in them, that have
Right.
cross grain. You're not supposed to use those, or you use them as a starter maybe, but you're not supposed to have them. But a lot of guys want to save the money. They want to make as much as they can, so they're throwing them in.
Right.
Or they're increasing the exposure too much, so you're actually showing more and gaining on the roof system. And those are the little tricks that they'll try and use to make more money off of a job. So it's trickier to get a good quality roof system than it used to be. And for that reason, I don't recommend going that way unless you really want that look.
So the relationship, of course, to quality and quality control, whether we're dealing with painting, whether we're dealing with roofing, has to also do with longevity of the job that was done.
Yeah.
So, and you know, it's interesting because we often work with strata corporations now that we have depreciation reports as a requirement, looking at life cycle of components. And you know, early components from the first year of a new building don't have the same level of life expectancy as replacement products frequently do. So we've replaced the roof after the first 15 years. The next roof may last 20, 25, or 30 years if we've managed to put in a quality product.
Some of that is driven by the fact that in the beginning, when the original contractor built the structure, they didn't care so much. They just wanted to make this really pretty building and sell it off and get their money and move on.
Well, and roofs are out of sight, out of mind.
Out of sight, out of mind in a lot of cases. Yeah. But even with ones that you can see, they're so high up, you can't see much unless you have binoculars and know what you're looking for. So what happens is that when it comes time to replace that first roof, people have learned a lesson. By living in that building for 20, you know, these gutters always leaked, or around the wall corners they always leaked, or the diverters at the walls always leaked, or there wasn't any. So these lessons are learned, and they now get somebody like our company in to come and actually design a roof system and focus on the roof system and spend a little bit more money but get some quality out of it, versus a general contractor who just wants the job done.
Just going back to our email about the roof deck, you know, before we lose sight of that, it's an interesting thing. If you look at it from the Strata Property Act and from the Strata Corporation's perspective, we had a little look at their bylaws. The roof decks themselves are limited common property, which they frequently are on a lot of buildings. And there's an unfortunate assumption made by consumers that homeowners are responsible for limited common property. It's your area, you maintain it, you repair it. And generally, when you look at that, it's not true. In most limited common property situations, the only thing that the bylaws or the act require you to do, unless the Strata's amended the bylaws, is basic custodial work. Sweeping, cleaning, that's it. You don't paint, you don't remove or replace products, you don't alter or change them. And you know, that's one of the challenges we have in our industry, is some of the misconceptions. And the misconception around limited common property being something that belongs to the owner owns it. They don't. It is essentially common property, but we've given you exclusive use of it. It shows on the Strata plan, but we have to look into the bylaws and say, so what's our responsibility? So for the people, 3 of the 4 people who painted their rooftops orange, green, and brown, which is a whole other discussion in another show, they've essentially done an alteration in their Strata. And looking at their bylaws, these people have done an alteration that wasn't authorized. The Strata wasn't aware of it. One person did it, thought it was a good idea. The next person does it. The next person after that. But the problem is now we have a maintenance issue and a potential risk of damage as a result of the drainage systems possibly failing through the winter.
And
you know,
those people, you know, through no fault of their or through a little bit of ignorance on what could happen. I mean, it takes one leaf to block a drain sometimes. Yeah. One maple leaf will block a drain, and it can cause a whole roof system to get flooded with a ton of water, lots of weight, and that weight can have an effect on the ceilings within the building because it can actually deflect the substrate and cause the ceilings to crack if it gets that heavy, which please don't let it get that heavy. And not to mention, it can allow water to get up to certain heights that aren't fully protected. So now you're possibly putting the building at risk of leakage in other areas aside from just around your deck. So it's a tremendous burden on the building.
Well, and planters, you know, that's the other problem in rooftop decks and balconies, is that unless the Strata strictly controls it, people put planters with trees, which are a great idea. It's wonderful to have the rooftop plantings, but it becomes a greater problem when they're not contemplating how much weight, what happens when these planters get saturated and freeze, the impact of all of these other components.
And the types of plants that they put in them.
Type of plants, well, especially if there's an exposure of the root system going beyond the planter, which is it's a discussion we might have after the break, actually.
Yeah.
Well, and in addition to that, to the pollen and the mildew and so on that can be created around that, can cause areas that are painted areas and so on to suddenly have a lot more mildew and a lot more need of repair than they would otherwise.
No, I was at a Strata this summer that rooftop decks, and they had a bunch of trees, Japanese maples and some evergreens in pots. They were up against a wall in a corner, and in behind the wall was absolutely covered with mildew, and you could just see a problem developing that can't get remedied without there being some air and some cleaning and some maintenance of these areas. So when we're back, we'll talk about rooftop planters. I'm Tony Giaventu. This is Key Pacific's Talk About Strata on 650 Sea Isle.
There's still more ahead with Experts on Call on Sea Isle 650.